Our sermon this morning, we're jumping to the book of John. Last week we were in the book of Mark, but what's the word I'm looking for here? The joy of the book of Mark is how concise it is. And so there's not a lot in there to say. So when we're in the year of Mark, we jump back and forth from Mark to John, if we're looking at the gospel. And so this week we're looking at the book of John, and it's one of my favorite passages in the Bible, especially in the Gospels. It's not a typical John passage that you see. Sometimes a John passage is kind of heady, if you will. We don't understand always where John is going with it, but this one's pretty straightforward. So that's why it's one of my favorites in John. It's John 1:43 through 51. If you're following along in a pew Bible, it's on page 87 in the New Testament. John 1:43 through 51. It reads this way. The next day, John decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me? Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. What good can come from Nazareth? No matter how many times we read this passage, no matter how many times anybody cites this passage, I think that's the question that sticks with us the most out of this passage, right? What good can come from Nazareth? And at first, we kind of shame Nathanael, don't we, and say, "Don't you know who this is? Don't you know who you're talking to? Don't you know who Jesus Christ is?" But then if we take a step back, we might understand we don't always know who this person is. We don't always know what he's calling us to. Did you ever have an experience or know of a person or a place or any concept that you were kind of prejudiced towards at first, but then once you actually experienced it, you said, "It's not so bad after all"? That's what Nathanael was doing here. A lot of you know that I started my college career at a big state university, Western Michigan University, and while they may not be well known around in the South, it was pretty. I shouldn't say prestigious. It was a pretty big university in Michigan. In fact, 85% of my graduating class from high school went to this university. I say that, but then there was 30,000 other students on the same campus at the same time that went to that university. And things didn't really pan out the way that I thought they would. But this was the college to go to. It was looked highly upon when I first started going there. And so I thought my experience was going to be spectacular, but I experienced a lot of anxiety. I made myself physically sick several times because of how tough it was for me to be at a big college. So I looked to transfer. When I was looking at different colleges to transfer to, I was looking about some the same size as Western. You know, we also have a Central Michigan University and Eastern Michigan University. And I was looking at some smaller ones, but the one that I ended up settling was the smallest college that I was looking at. It was the only one that accepted me into the music program right away, but I wasn't really looking forward to it. I always had this prejudice towards the small college. I always had this idea that if you went to a small college, it was basically a second high school, was my thought. But, and I was going to, I knew that it would be a little different in the fact that I didn't know any of my roommates, even before I got to Albion. I didn't know my roommate sophomore year. I didn't know my roommate, I knew my roommate junior year, but I didn't know him before I transferred to Albion. But if you ask me now, there's nothing I would change about my transfer to Albion. It was one of the best experiences of my life, and I learned so much from that experience. On my graduation day, I had the opportunity while, the boring 3-hour ceremony was happening, I had an opportunity to personally reflect on my anxiety of transferring from a big university to a small college. And I told myself that I was much better for it to transfer. And it was an almost instant. Once I moved into Albion, I knew something was different. I knew that it was going to be great. That's kind of like Nathaniel, isn't it? At first, Nathaniel had this prejudice towards people in Nazareth because can anything good come out of Nazareth? You see, it was a small town who was literally dependent upon the bigger town that it was probably about 6 miles away from. It was literally economically dependent upon that city. So the idea was, if this person was as good as they said they were, they would come from Sepphoris, not from Nazareth. They would have situated themselves in Sepphoris and not Nazareth. But I experienced this again when we moved after graduation from college, after our wedding, 2 days after our wedding, in fact, we moved to Atlanta. It's a city that I had never been in before. I had driven through, but I had never been before. But if you ask me now, there's nothing I would change about my seminary experience, about going to Emory, about living in Atlanta. There's nothing I would have changed about that. Because while I had this prejudice, and while I had these thoughts that it's just another big city, it's not going to be all that great. We're small suburban people, we're not city people. It was a great experience. Coming out on the other side, I understood that good can happen from even those things that we're uncomfortable with, even those things that we have an ingrained hatred towards, or ingrained dislike, I should say, towards. There were stereotypes about, before we got to Atlanta, you should hear some of the things that the Northerners say about Atlanta. So we were going with those stereotypes, we were going with those in mind, but yet we experienced none of what was spoken. How many times do we do that, friends? How many times are we told about somebody or something or somewhere, and so before we even experience that person or that place or that thing, we have this notion in our mind exactly how it's going to go, and then we change our mind after we actually experience that. Before we go in any deeper into that, let's look at Samuel first. Let's look at the passage from Samuel. This is a great passage from Samuel. If we had kept reading, and I don't think you would want to read 10 more verses of Samuel, so if we had kept reading those 10 verses, you would find out that God, in his calling of Samuel, do you know what he told Samuel when Samuel finally started paying attention? God told Samuel that he was going to bring destruction on every single thing that Eli had. He was going to bring Eli's life to an end very quickly, and it wasn't going to be a quiet or peaceful thing at all. And Samuel had to tell his mentor, the person who had raised him, because remember, Samuel was given to the temple at a very young age. He didn't know his parents. He didn't know Hannah and Elkanah. He only knew Eli. So effectively, this was his father, and yet he had to be the one to preach this bad news to him. Now, Eli is probably the complete opposite of me, because if I heard that news, I'd be so anxious, I'd be so nervous, I'd be so depressed. But what did Eli say after that? He said, if it's God's will, let it be done. Friends, can anything good come out of telling somebody bad news? Can anything good come out of about doing something that we don't want to do? Can anything good come out of what God has in mind for us? I can relate a lot to Samuel's story. There were several times in my life that God was telling me that this was my chosen vocation. It wasn't my chosen vocation, it was God's chosen vocation for me. But I didn't listen. I went the other way. I did what I wanted to do. I pretended that I didn't hear. I think a lot of us can be guilty of that, pretending we didn't hear God's call in our life. And I'm not just talking about vocation. I'm not just talking about big things. We don't always hear, or we pretend not to hear God's calling, even on the small things. So I pretended not to hear, and I went the other way. And then finally, I had that moment where, do you remember in the Samuel passage, there was, after the third time that Eli told him to go back and lay down, it didn't say that God called him again. It said that God appeared. God came to the room where Samuel was and then called out. That's the type of experience that we're all looking for. That's the type of experience that's the only way we're going to do anything, is if God appears among us. God has come to us. God appears among us each and every day, and yet we ignore him. So when I received my call to ministry, when I finally accepted, I should say, my call to ministry, I still had one question, and it was basically, I had just been reading this passage of Nathaniel and John, and so it's basically the same thing. Can anything good come from me in ministry? That was the question that I asked. Can anything good come from me in ministry? And then my father-in-law told me, who wasn't my father-in-law yet, but he told me something about his own call story when his pastor friend told him, God doesn't call us based on how we view ourselves. God calls us based on how he sees us in the future. Our gifts and graces, our self-perceived gifts and graces don't matter. The gifts and graces that God sees in us is what matters. Can anything good come out of us doing anything God calls us to? The answer is yes. God can be praised. Jesus can have another disciple. So let's jump back to Nathaniel for a second. Now, some people kind of sweep this passage under the rug, and there's a reason for that. If you think of the 12 disciples, I can't recall them all right now, but if I were able to name off all the disciples, Nathanael would not be part of the 12. Even after Judas died and they kind of effectively replaced him, they replaced him with Matthias. They didn't replace him with Nathanael. So who is and that's why they sweep him under the rug, because what does John know about the disciples if he can't even get the name of one of the disciples right? Here's the thing. Some people say Nathanael is Bartholomew. All three of the first Gospels call him Bartholomew, but John calls him Nathanael. It's possible that his name was Nathanael Bartholomew, and they just called him by Bartholomew. I'm not going to get into the etymology of words, but if you see bar at the beginning of any Hebrew word, it means son of. So it's possible that Bartholomew wasn't actually his name, and this was Nathanael. So before you start sweeping this one under the rug and say that this story doesn't matter for the grand scheme of things because it wasn't a disciple being called and it was just a random person, it could have been a disciple. This could have been Bartholomew's call story. Nathanael was working from stereotypes, though, wasn't he? He had never been, as far as we know, he had never even been to Nazareth. He had never even met anybody from Nazareth. He had never even he had heard of Nazareth in the form of, it's a terrible city, never go there. People from there are the worst people that you could possibly experience. Friends, he had never been there. He had never met somebody from there, and yet his question was still, can anything good come from Nazareth? I'm guilty of this, and I'm sure a lot of us are. I'm sure a lot of us are as well. We have this inclination that we just go by whatever somebody says, even if we've never experienced it before in our lives. Can we all say that we're guilty of that? Our friend would tell us, my experience of this was terrible. You never want to go there, so we don't go there. Or we get anxious, and when we're there, we can't experience it fully because we all have all of these thoughts in our minds. But I'm going to turn the question around. Can anything good come out of preconceived notions? Can anything good come out of somebody else's experience? Can anything good come out of the thoughts that somebody else puts in our own mind? I'm going to say no. Nothing good can come from that until we experience Christ ourselves. I worked in inner city Detroit for 3 months after graduation from college, and if you've never been, you should. And that was the opposite of what 100% of the people who I talked to before my experience said. They all said, you don't want to go there. There's too much going on there. There's too many drugs. There's too many murders. You'll just get mixed up in that kind of world. And here I am on the other side. I didn't get mixed up in that world. When the two Michigan conferences, Michigan used to be 2 different annual conferences in the United Methodist Church. It's now 1, but they had been talks for 20 years before they actually merged. And they used to be the West Michigan Conference and the Detroit Conference. And when they were in talks, it was basically a pastor from the West Michigan Conference said, "Do they even have birds in Detroit?" He had literally heard that there was no such thing as bird in Detroit. And he was using that as justification for not wanting to merge. He had never been to Detroit, and I should admit that until I was about 16, I had never been to Detroit, even though I'd lived in Michigan my whole life. I had never been to Detroit until I was about 16, and even then it was for a very short time. But we use our preconceived notions to form opinions of places, and they're not always founded. So Nathanael quickly came around, didn't he? Because what happened? So Philip told Nathanael about Jesus, and then Nathanael had the question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And then Jesus started talking to Nathanael. Sometimes that's what it takes, isn't it, for Jesus to start talking to us before we actually understand. Nathanael wasn't going to be persuaded without actually talking to Jesus, though, was he? Because Philip could have told him until he was blue in the face how great Jesus was. And what did Philip say? He didn't say, we've heard of or we saw in passing Jesus. No, he said, we found, we experienced, we saw. And then Philip said, come and see. I sat through a fascinating sermon one time where the pastor used his son's first birthday as an analogy. A lot of first birthdays, you have, the cake that everybody's going to eat off of, but then what do you have in front of the toddler? A smash cake, right? So that they can literally smash their face into or start grabbing at. Evan had nothing to do with his smash cake, but Adeline, I can show you pictures, and it was a sight to see and a mess to clean up. That's for sure. But he used his son's smash cake, and at first, he just kind of dipped his finger into it, and then with more and more encouragement, he dipped 2 fingers into it, and then with more and more encouragement, he finally put both of his hands in there, grabbed the cake, and just shoved it in his face. And he used that to say, that's how we experience Jesus. We at first only want to touch him just a little bit, and then we might touch him a little more. And then finally, on the 3rd or 4th or 100 millionth try, we actually grab a hold of Jesus' cloak. Why can't we do that the first time? Because of our preconceived notions. No matter how many times we talk to people, sometimes our opinions would not be changed from what we've been told before. Now, I lied to you a little bit ago. Not 100% of the people who gave me a bad view of Detroit, or when I told people of inner city Detroit before going, not 100% of the people gave me a bad view. It was more like 99.9, and there was about one person who said, yes, go, experience. Of course, it was the leader of the mission that I was going to work for, but still, he lived in that community. He thrived in that community. But that 99.9% were just nagging in my head until I experienced for myself. We listen to anybody but God when it comes to doing ministry. We listen to our friends. We listen to our own opinions. But we don't listen to God. Take a note from Nathanael. Once you experience the living, breathing Jesus Christ, put all preconceived notions aside. I really wish I would have known what Nathanael said about Nazareth after he talked with Jesus, but we don't have that. There's the last passage the last verse that we read, verse 51 in this passage. You might have seen an analogy. John liked to make analogies. It was an analogy to Jacob's ladder. What did he say? That angels would be ascending and descending on the ladder. That's how Jesus comes to help us experience God. You may have been in contact with an angel and not even known it. And yet, because of our preconceived notions, we don't even want to hear that. Because our preconceived notions of angels being the things with wings and the things with halos above their heads, we don't want to hear that anybody could be a spirit from God to guide us along the right way. So friends, my question for you today, can anything good come out of us not following Jesus Christ? Can anything good come out of preconceived notions that maybe our friends or our family have ingrained into us? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.